Welcome to the Anthropology in Business podcast, where you'll learn about the many ways anthropology is applied in business and why business anthropology is one of the most effective lenses for making sense of organizations and consumers. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in advertising, marketing, consumer behavior, organizational culture, user experience, and many other roles, you'll learn firsthand what it means to do business anthropology and how the work differs from academic anthropology. We will discuss issues like the pace and depth of research in business, our visibility and influence as practitioners, and what we can do to build our brand. We will also focus on the value and impact of our research in business so that we can help business leaders understand why they should be hiring anthropologists. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of the Anthropology in Business podcast. I'm here today with Melissa Vogel. Melissa is the Director of Qualitative Research at Hanover Research. She was previously at Clemson for 15 years and started the Business Anthropology certificate that you've seen around on the internet. So today we'll be talking about, we'll touch on the certificate, but we're also going to be talking about what it really means to sort of lead a research team. And we're going to talk a little bit about the transition from academia to business. So Melissa, before we kind of get into some of those things, you want to maybe just start by telling us kind of how you came into anthropology?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you so much for inviting me, Matt. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Growing up, I was very fortunate that my parents liked to travel and that they took my sister and I with them. And on many of those trips, we went either out west in the United States to various Native American sites and reservations and such. And even on one trip to Mexico to a Maya site down there. And I was always interested in learning about the rest of the world, learning other languages. And so I actually went to college planning to be an international relations, political science major, and then realized that a lot of those folks were planning to be lawyers, and I had no interest in being a lawyer. I just wanted to travel the world and learn about people and cultures and languages. And so I discovered anthropology really after I got to college and loved it and loved all my professors and just decided this was it for me.
You know, it's funny, having had conversations with you, I think you would have been a good lawyer.
My dad thinks so too. He would have preferred that.
Well, most parents would prefer anything to anthropology, I think.
Yeah, a funny story. So when I told my dad I was switching my major, he said, "What? You want to be poor for the rest of your life?" I said, "Yes, Dad, that's my plan, to be poor for the rest of my life." But when I became a successful tenured professor, he changed his tune. So, sometimes you can prove your parents wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, a theme of the podcast and a theme of today is that there is actually, good paying jobs out there for us in business anthropology. Not to say that you can't make any money in academia, but there's there's family sustaining salaries out there in business for researchers. And so while maybe anthropologists were less well off at some point in history, today, for those of us who are practicing, it can be we don't have to be poor anymore, which is an upside. And that's kind of a lot of what we're trying to show on this podcast and through all the other business anthropology efforts that we're kind of engaged in. And so, but thanks for sharing, your background. So, also kind of worth pointing out, you spent quite a bit of time then working in the field as an archaeologist. And while I have talked to a few archaeologists on the show, maybe one or two others, it's less common. And so, before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of the business component, you want to maybe talk a little bit about archaeology, and maybe we can kind of get into how you think that actually has helped you, whereas maybe some people don't think it's, the right fit.
Yeah, I did want to mention that I want current students or recent grads of anthropology, especially in the U.S., where most of them go through a 4 fields or 3 fields program, to know that the stuff you're learning in either your major or your graduate program is extremely applicable to business, and your skills are all transferable. You just have to know how to reinterpret those for a business audience. And it doesn't really matter which subfield you specialized in. For example, so as an archaeologist, one thing that sometimes distinguishes us from the other subfields is that we always work in teams. So there's no such thing, the whole, Indiana Jones thing, as much as we love the Hollywood, attention, that's all a myth, right? We don't ever work alone, right? Very rarely do we do anything alone. And so you learn very early on in the process how to both be a good team member and then eventually to be a team leader and a team manager. And especially once you're running your own projects, you learn so many project management and people management skills out of necessity. And frankly, if you don't, you're probably going to have trouble in your projects, because those skills are really essential to running a successful archaeological project. And of course, I'm sure there's cultural and biological anthropologists who also work in teams. It just seems to be a little less common on the academic side. So I think those are really important skills that I picked up as an archaeologist. All of the ability to write, to speak in public, to present your ideas. Granted, you use a different style in the academic world than you would in the business world, but you have to be able to articulate what you want to say, both in writing and verbally, especially if you're teaching. And teaching, I think, for anyone who's, had a chance to teach even as a grad assistant, is really important, because you have to learn how to speak to different levels of audiences, right? So you're not just going to be talking to your peers or to people who are more advanced than you. You're going to have to teach things to folks who have no idea what you're talking about. And that's extremely applicable to the business world. You're going to be dealing with a huge range of audiences, and the ability to translate your learning and your findings to a wide range of participants and audiences is extremely useful.
Yeah, no, that's a great point about teaching, and something that I don't think has come up yet, but it's certainly well said, given the way that we do need to present frequently to, people, again, who in business really don't understand what we do. First, as anthropologists, and, in my space, what like UX is or what product management is, a lot of that is still, new and young. So frequently we're talking to people who don't really understand, what it is. So that's a great point. Also in there, though, on the teams, and I went to an applied program, so I didn't have the classic sort of, four-field kind of training. Are you in, I'm not sure what an archaeological project really looks like, but are you in like a, team of diverse stakeholders where you're also working with a lot of other professions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so just to give you an example, I spent most of my career working in Peru, and you're not only dealing with an international team, because I brought students from the U.S. I even occasionally had ones from other countries like Canada. You have Peruvian students and colleagues who get involved, so folks at different levels. You hire local folks to work on your project, so folks who have absolutely no academic training in what you're doing at all. And you're probably going to have an interdisciplinary team as well, because you can't be a specialist in all things that you're studying. So, I had an osteologist to focus on the human skeletal remains. I had a botanical and faunal remains specialist to help me identify all of those remains. You recruit people that specialize in certain areas, even things like skill sets, like we would hire an artist to draw things for us. Unfortunately, we relied on me for the photography, which was probably not always the best, since I'm not a formally trained photographer. But yeah, so, you get used to working, with interdisciplinary, for some of us, international teams. You have a whole range of stakeholders. For example, my projects always had what we call a public interest component. So we would have some way that we were engaging with the local community and trying to do it on their terms. So what they were interested in, not just what we were interested in, which in the case of my last project, they wanted to learn English. And I was really lucky that one of the grad students working with me was willing to volunteer his time on Saturdays and go out and hang out with them and, teach them a little bit of English in his spare time, which was just above and beyond. So shout out to David Pacifico, who's now at Wisconsin-Madison teaching. So, but yeah, so you really have to learn how to manage those different stakeholders and in most cases deal with government regulations, which can be great preparation for going into any kind of government related work because you have to get permits and you have to file reports and you have to, get on, for example, the National Registry of Archaeologists in the country that you're working in. So there's just a huge laundry list of things that you're going to learn in that path that are then going to be applicable to the private sector or to government or nonprofit jobs also.
Got it. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I didn't know the details again of any kind of archaeological project, but it really does sound like it is quite a good fit, given all those, given the sort of diversity of people that you're working with, certainly the amount of project management that would go into leading that and coordinating that across borders, and so that's pretty cool, and definitely helps me better understand, why that's such a good fit, and will kind of help me keep that in mind going forward for anybody else I talk to. So
it helps with mixed methods too, because, most archaeologists have to use both quantitative and qualitative measures in their work. So at least in my opinion, you have to be comfortable moving between both, a scientific method approach where you have hypotheses that you're testing and you have measurable data that you're collecting. I mean, one of the major things we do that's very useful in the business world is we work with spatial data. So we work with things like ArcGIS to map spatial distribution of things. But you still have that qualitative component because you're still interpreting lots of things that are subjective and that don't have, clearly identified meanings to them. And so you have to interpret that. So you have to be flexible about moving between both the scientific and humanistic or interpretive I'm going to throw in epistemology there. Maybe that's not a good idea for this audience. I don't know. But you have to be able to move between those worlds and be okay with that, which, was really interesting to me when I moved more into, not instead of just doing the occasional business project to doing it more full time. It was fascinating to me that people are very hung up on one or the other, quantitative or qualitative. And I think that's a little bit unique that we're able to move back and forth between those worlds pretty easily.
Yeah, no, it's also a great point, and very much like, many of our jobs. I mean, again, in the UX space, there are some clearly defined kind of qual roles for sure. But I have always found in my experience, it's a little bit of both. And so it definitely gives me a new outlook on archaeology. So thanks for sharing that. Now, you didn't, despite all this talk about how that relates to business, you didn't go directly into business by any means.
No.
I mean, you've done some consulting for a long time, kind of, on the side, but you were in academia for, 15 or so years. So, one of the great things to come out of that is the business anthropology certificate. But it's, I guess it also brings up the question, why change sort of mid-career, even though you're doing some consulting on the side, why make the change to go full-time into business?
Yeah. So what I did, as far as I know, is extremely rare, right? So most folks who transition out of academia into the private sector, I think usually do it either while they're still doing their grad program or right after their grad program, or maybe they're, doing various adjunct professorships and not having luck getting a tenure track, or they even started a tenure track and for whatever reason it was not working out the way they hoped. And so they decided to, go into more applied work. I was actually a tenured full professor and I was graduate coordinator of our master's program in social science. And, I guess I'm a perpetual, overachiever, always wanting more options, because I was really starting to feel like I had kind of done all I could do in academia. Like, that was it, and I was 42. So, that was odd because I didn't plan to retire for at least 40 more years or 35. We'll see how good my health is. But so, I thought, I really want more options. And, doing the academic path can be very narrow. You have to meet certain milestones, and with some rare exceptions of people who are able to overcome all kinds of odds, you have to meet them in a certain time period, right? Because it's really tough if you go back and do your PhD later in life, for example, to get one of those tenure track assistant professor jobs, right? There's definitely like an ageist bias and all that kind of stuff. So it was weird to be on the other end and feel like, I did it. Now what? Now what are my options? And I didn't see a whole lot of options, to be honest. And I think another important thing I'd like to mention, because I think, unfortunately, when we're talking about careers, sometimes we shy away from talking about the personal side of things, right? And, for me, I really much wanted to be a mom and have a family. And I am the kind of person that if you try to tell me, oh, well, you can't, be a good academic or a good anthropologist or archaeologist and be a mom, first thing I'm going to do is go prove you wrong. So, and I had, unfortunately, professors who said those things to me as a grad student. And it just, actually it was usually sexist statements about, I don't know why we train women. They just go off and have babies, right? So I actually had my son right about the time I got tenure. So, that didn't stop me from becoming a full professor. But I just realized that, continuing to work internationally and have the sort of family life that I wanted to have was going to be extremely difficult. And you get to a point where, your priorities shift, right? I'd already done some amazing, I am thrilled and grateful that I got to do the amazing work I was able to do internationally. And I still, when he's older, might go back to working more internationally, but I want to be around, and didn't want everything to be super hard. So, it just, the private sector became more and more appealing, and I just realized I had so many more options. And the wonderful thing is, as you alluded to, it doesn't mean I have to stop teaching forever, because I created this business anthropology program. They still teach it at Clemson for the students for credit. And then at the moment, I'm still teaching it for professionals online. So I kind of feel like I won the lotto, because I get the best of both worlds now. And no pressure to publish anymore. Did that already too.
Yeah. So, I can see why you would make the change, but there's also some other considerations, when making such a change. Obviously being at such a stage in your career, there's, financial considerations. Of course, there's geographic considerations. Are you in a location where you can find adequate work, at sort of your seniority, et cetera, right? And there's all these sort of other things that, if you're, I don't know, if you're young, maybe you sort of, kind of take what you take wherever it is, right, at that time in your life. But you have a family, again, you've reached a certain status. So not all jobs are applicable, right? Or desirable maybe at that point. So there's obviously some challenges there that maybe some of us, who have kind of come right out of the programs and gone into work have not dealt with. So anything that would be interesting to share for other listeners who are in a similar place? Because, actually, if I could just comment, you said that you think you did something rare. And I imagine it is rarer, but I've had a fair amount of people who are in a similar place who are now thinking about leaving after, sustained time in academia. So I think more people are realizing that, there's other options out there. And maybe that's because of, politics that, in academia, changing sort of nature of academia. But nonetheless, there's more people who I think are now mid-career and looking to make the change. So how about all those things?
Post-pandemic, especially.
Yeah, sure, right. So how about like, any thoughts on that? Anything you learned by doing that at your stage in the career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hit on most of it. When we apply for academic jobs as anthropologists, one thing we don't have that maybe, super in demand professions might have available to them is geographic choice, right? So I realized when I applied for academic jobs that I was going to have to be willing to go where the job was. And I had certain things I wasn't willing to do. Like, I'm just not a winter person, so I could not survive like Michigan. I just would be miserable, like in the upper Midwest or something like that. But other than that, when I took the job at Clemson, I didn't know a single soul in the entire state of South Carolina, had no background, family history there, nothing, had to go there alone as a single woman. And let me tell you, that was not fun for dating. And so you make those sacrifices when you take an academic job as an anthropologist a lot of times. Like you said, once you have a family and a partner who has a job, and, I also happen to have stepchildren who are at various stages of their schooling, you can't just do the same thing again, usually. You can't just be like, I'm just going to go wherever I find the best job, right? So, yeah, I spent several years looking nearby. Mostly for me, the nearest towns, the bigger cities were, Charlotte and Atlanta. And unfortunately for me, the Southeast was just not really getting the whole idea of how someone with a PhD and an academic background was going to be super beneficial for their business. The good news is I have a wonderful partner. My husband was like, look, babe, it's not working out here. So where else should we look? And you don't always have that, like it could have been for example, if my stepkids had been younger, I would have just had to keep looking. But luckily they were getting old enough. They were going off to college. And so, we said, okay, we would be willing to go to DC because we would still be on the East Coast where the kids were, but not super far, I just found that DC, first job I applied to, hired me in 5 weeks. I mean, they understand in this area, and I think a lot of the larger cities, probably LA, New York, San Francisco, maybe Chicago, like they understand the value of someone with an advanced degree. And you have less of a job convincing them of that. Whereas, I went through hiring processes, for example, with Charlotte-based businesses where I'd go through 4 or 5 interviews. I was clearly one of their top candidates and not get offered the job. And I was fortunate, most of the time they won't give you feedback to let you know what was it that didn't make the cut. But I had one hiring manager who I ended up basically becoming friends with and presenting with at Epic, who was willing to share with me. She said, you made me realize something. You made me realize I have a bias against academics. I just assume that, they're not going to be able to cut it in the business world, with our fast-paced environment and the practicalities of serving our clients. And, they're just going to be spouting Foucault in the clouds. And, I, of course, disabused her of those ideas and explained how, especially in my past, I was working in a developing country on a shoestring budget, with a team of 30 people. So, that blew her mind, So unfortunately, if you are dealing with those smaller markets, you probably will have to do a lot more explaining of how your background and training is extremely useful and transferable to the business world.
Is there anything that you observed, when say going from the Charlotte market to the DC market? I know you said that they just kind of got it in the DC market, but did they say anything that maybe helped give you some indication of how somebody could present themselves better in a market like Charlotte?
I mean, not from talking to folks in DC, but from talking to folks in Charlotte, yes. So, I think you really need to just, as anthropologists, we learn how to adapt to different cultures and how to, literally speak languages that are not our first language. It's the same thing for the business world. You need to steep yourself in the lingo of the business world, and things that at first sound really strange to you after time and practice, just like anywhere else you would go in the world, are going to become very natural. I mean, for example, just the incredible use of acronyms in the business world, which confusingly can change from company to company. So be careful with that. But, just knowing things like what's a KPI, what's ROI, like very, very common acronyms that are used in the business world. Being able to, instead of saying like, I could tell somebody, hey, I ran an archaeological dig in Peru with 30 people over the course of about 7 years. They're not going to like turn that into, I know how to manage people. I know how to manage teams. I know how to create cross-disciplinary collaborations. I can manage a budget, right? Like you have to translate all of those things into business speak, right? And that's got to all be on your resume because, you're not even going to get to the interview to explain it if it's not already there. Sure. So, yeah, the more that you can, pair up with someone who has that knowledge, whether it's through, if you're still in school, through the Career Center, or if you're already out of school, just talking to friends and colleagues. And there's even, if you have the money, it can be expensive. There's even folks you can hire to help you do that. So.
Yeah. And so how did you go about that? Did you sort of just naturally push your way through it or kind of have the intuition to do it?
I did all of the above except pay somebody. So, I mean, I started reading stuff. You get onto sites like LinkedIn and start learning, like, what are people posting about? What is sort of the way that people present themselves? Although I know that's been changing lately, too. It's been a little bit less purely professional in business than it used to be lately. But, every person who wants to make it in the business world from academia has got to be on LinkedIn. Like academics don't even care about LinkedIn. If you want to be found in the business world, you need a good LinkedIn profile. And, same thing that applies to your resume applies to that. So I took tips from the Career Center that was talking to my students. I mean, they were telling my students how to present themselves on LinkedIn. And I was like, let me take some notes here, So, the same stuff that they were getting from the Career Center, I was using, talking to friends. And, frankly, I have an amazingly supportive partner who, my husband was happy to be like, well, hon, you've done this, this, and this. Let's put that on your resume, right? Like, because he could see, knowing me and knowing all that I had done, how that would work in his world, because he's in fintech. So, like, he could figure out and help me with that. And then eventually, and this is tougher, it is tougher, at least in my experience, to actually get to the recruiter phase where you're talking to recruiters. But if you can connect with recruiters, they can be extremely helpful because, especially for folks who might be a little further along in their careers and really need that recruiter connection, they can tell you what they're looking for to pick you out of LinkedIn. And so that, to me, that was kind of like a weird graduation day. The first time that a recruiter that I had no idea what job they were looking for reached out to me. I had not applied to the job and they just contacted me out of the blue. And I thought I was being spammed. And my husband was like, this looks legit, like you should talk to them. So, those are things that, it just takes a lot of time and practice and using your network and every resource you can find, and don't be shy about it.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, recruiters, where I was going to then go with that was networking. And so, I know from just various things that you're involved in that, you have a network, you know people in the industry. So, aside from just, applying, were you also sort of trying to work through your network?
Yeah, a little bit. But, it's always tough for folks who have a job and are thinking about moving on to another job. You have to be a little bit more cautious. You can't, one thing I think students and folks that are recent graduates have an advantage of is they can just fly the flag that they're looking for work, right? And that's tougher to do if you're not trying to get kicked out of your current job. Yeah, sure. Before you find the next one, So yes, but you have to be a little more discreet about how you do that,
Yeah.
So, but yes,
you probably can't go to career services and ask.
Well, except, you can to some extent because, just like you would have like doctor-patient privilege. You can ask if you're an academic at a university, you can go to career services and say, hey, I really would like to ask some questions. Can you keep this confidential? And unless they just have no ethical sense, I think they will do that. So
fast forward, and you're at Hanover Research now in the DC area. You're in a director role, so you're not conducting much research, is my understanding, mostly leading. Yeah. So, that's you were planning the anthropological project, the archaeological project. So you obviously had leadership capacity back then as well. But being in a director role is very different than being hands-on. So kind of curious, for somebody who, likes research, is there a reason you felt that you wanted to be in a director role versus some kind of senior research role?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm still not opposed to being the person doing the hands-on research. And of course, whenever my team needs me, I can jump in there. It just so happened that until recently, I was the only person on my team who spoke enough Spanish to do any Spanish language interviews. So if we needed one or two done, I was the one who was doing those. In fact, it got to the point where we were having such demand that I deliberately went out and hired 2 native Spanish speakers, because I'm not supposed to be spending most of my time conducting interviews. But I just got to a point, even before I left academia, where I really got a lot of joy out of helping, younger researchers develop and grow, and, providing them with professional development opportunities. I just really enjoy that. So, I was doing that as the graduate coordinator. I ran our professional development seminar for them, and took turns with another professor doing the undergraduate professional development seminar. So that's just a role I enjoy. So I would say if you don't enjoy that, then no, you should not go for being, a manager of a research team, because I actually have a team member who that's not really her forte, and she's very good at it, but that's not really her thing. She doesn't like it. So, unfortunately, sometimes we have to beg her to do it because we need her. But when we can let her out of it, I let her out of it, because she likes doing the research herself, And I think everybody can go through, fluctuations in their career where, there's a time when they really want to dig in and do it all themselves. And then, maybe they get a little tired of that and they want to step back a little and be the one, helping coordinate and, leading other folks who are doing the day-to-day operations. So I think there's a place for both things. But one thing I would caution people who are thinking long-term about a career in business anthropology is, I do think, maybe not all cases, but you're going to be asked to manage other people at some point if you want to keep climbing the ladder. So that is something to think about as you're, progressing in your career is, do you want to do that? And how can you pick up those, management skills and people skills along the way if that's not something that you naturally gravitate to?
And also worth pointing out that if it's something that you really don't like doing, you may also be, you may want to say no if that opportunity is presented to you, because if you find yourself in that position and you don't like it, we've all seen like say in the tech space, it's kind of classic, like for engineers to kind of progress into leadership roles who don't really want to be in them. And it depends on the person, but if it goes wrong, you now may be out of a job, whereas before you could have been a very high performer, as an engineer, say, right? And so, it's also good to kind of know, obviously, we can grow, we can learn, we can change, but if you really don't like it, it's good to know the limitations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And depending on the company and what roles they have available, I think it's pretty fair to say in most smaller companies, you're going to hit a glass ceiling, right? If you're not interested in managing people. If you're maybe at a giant corporation, maybe there's more room for you to continue on being an individual contributor. But I mean, I can say at least at my current company, we're relatively small, and you just can't get beyond a certain point if you're not willing to manage people. So,
sure. Yeah, over the years, for about a decade now, I've worked with company in the career development area, and I think the saying is "up is not the only way out," which comes from one of the books they've written. And more or less, the kind of point is though, also, say in a large organization, it's again harder in small ones, but you can oftentimes find, if you're creative, you can find interesting lateral moves to make. Um, some of that comes like from being kind of like an entrepreneur and finding your own opportunities and maybe, sort of starting something up. But, if you get creative and you really don't like that and you're in a larger place, there's oftentimes opportunity. I mean, even in small ones, there is oftentimes the opportunity to sort of create something new if you're willing to take the lead and sort of dig in and do that. So just worth pointing out. But to come back to something you just said, so your team is small. And so while this is not always the case, oftentimes I find in smaller organizations, there might, the research area might have gone through less of like a formalization process or maybe less of a maturity process, maybe it's even kind of new to the organization, just, in terms of years. So sometimes in environments like that, we have to do a lot of educating. And again, we have to do a lot of educating usually, but oftentimes in smaller places, it seems like there's a little bit more to do early on. And so I'm wondering if you have any experiences there and sort of what you do to sell the value of, obviously not just anthropology, but, social science and the kind of research that we do within the business context.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm fortunate that, since I'm at a market research firm, I mean, I don't really have to sell the value of, being a good researcher and applying best practices and all of that to our internal colleagues. But we certainly may have to explain things to our external clients. And for us, what's a little bit more challenging is specifically the qualitative piece, because a lot of firms start with things like survey or secondary research, and maybe, especially with the advent of big data and analytics, gotten into the quantitative piece. And tech world, of course, has latched on to qualitative, but some other areas of business have not. And so you really do have to be willing, in a very non-condescending, simple way, explain to clients the value of qualitative research. And I always love to use examples, saying things like, granted now with COVID, we haven't been getting to do much observational research, but, people will often tell you one thing in a survey, but actually do another, right? And so the only way you're going to know that they're actually doing something different from what they told you is having that qualitative piece, right? Or even just, you don't know if you're asking the right questions, if they're all closed-ended questions, right? If you're just, in a survey, you give people 4 or 5 options, or you have a Likert scale 1 to 5. If you don't have open-ended questions and let someone lead a conversation down a road you weren't expecting, you have no idea what insights that you're not going to discover if you don't do that qualitative piece. So I like trying to explain to them how important it is to consider, depending on what their business problem is, having a qualitative component to that research. So, and that's something I'm just going to keep refining and refining, because you're going to have to make those explanations and speeches over and over and over again.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, we're in a similar position to some degree in that, if you're sort of like, Red Associates or IDEO or Stripe Partners or somebody who has some name recognition, right? When people are coming to you, they kind of have an idea of what they're asking for, even if they don't fully understand it. But like oftentimes, we have clients, some of which are quite small, some of which are global, but they still don't get it. Some of which are quite small and certainly don't even aren't even asking for research when, say, maybe I'm bringing it up and suggesting that we ought to do this, before we just build something. And so in those situations, I'm having the same kind of conversations. But it's, I still find that even though if you explain it that way, that the degree of acceptance varies widely. And There's lots of reasons for that, I'm sure, some of which is time and budget, and sometimes we just, they don't have the money to do it or the time to do it. But other times, there's like an interest and maybe there's time and budget, but it still doesn't go somewhere. It's still maybe not clicking. So is there anything that, maybe you've learned through sort of selling this, if you will, that aside from kind of the way you just described it, any like kind of particular strategy maybe that you found really interesting, even in the way you present it, like with any aids or anything that you sort of bring in or any case studies, and maybe not the specific data of the case studies, but is there anything that you found as like an aid that really helps you kind of convey to somebody?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I tend to rely heavily on sort of the classic examples that I use in my business anthropology class. So, one of my favorites is the story of Gogurt with Susan Squire's study. So, not to recap that whole thing, people can look it up if they're interested. But, it was a very similar situation where, parents were telling this breakfast food company one thing about how they feed their kids breakfast, very nutritious, very important, all this. And then lo and behold, she goes into their homes to watch them actually getting out the door in the morning and sees a whole different story of, how kids are just, throwing their breakfast in the trash, not touching it, or stealing a snack from the cupboard, or what. I mean, all these different things she watched. And lo and behold, it ends up developing a whole new product to serve a need that company, had they not done that research, wouldn't have known their customers had, because their customers weren't telling them that. And, there's Trisha Wang's famous TED Talk where she talks about, the work she did in China and trying to explain to Nokia, how excited even low income people were about these smartphones. And, they said, well, we didn't get that in our survey data. Well, you didn't ask that question. You didn't know to ask the question, right? So I like using those very concrete examples of things people know. Most people know what Gogurt is, at least in the US. Like, they know that Nokia is no longer the dominant cell phone company in the world that it used to be. So you can use these really concrete examples of how, you can win by doing this type of qualitative research, or you can lose out by ignoring it. And I think that really brings it home to people. But you're potentially challenging. I mean, this goes back to the whole, ontological perspective. You're challenging their worldview, right? Because, for a lot of business folks, we're at a point in history where data is king and they want to know all about the metrics, and they're easily dazzled, frankly, by, doing some, big data analytics and showing them lovely, graphics. And you can do awesome visualizations with that stuff. But that won't tell you why. Right? So I think that's always a great thing to present the case for a mixed method study, right? Like, yes, let's use all this wonderful sales data you have. Let's see what your patterns are, what's winning, what's not winning. And then let's ask people why, which you can't do with that data. So.
Yeah, I studied under Dr. Squires, and so I use some of the same examples, and I have also used Cologuard and a few others, and find them instructive. But still, I guess to your point about how you're sort of, you're sort of pushing up against their worldview a bit. Sometimes it is still a bit challenging because conveying. While we can kind of describe that Nokia fell off a cliff, and that is more or less, that's kind of easy to understand. Still, a little bit about what we deliver and how we deliver that is still a little nebulous oftentimes. And so, to building on that comment, I'd like to maybe get into a little bit about this sort of research leadership, in the sense that ultimately you are leading these researchers. You need to sort of gauge their performance kind of collectively as a team. You need to sell it and convince, your clients, so that, not just that you present interesting insights, but so that they can, use them ultimately, right? So that they're applicable. And so to sort of pick off a little bit of that first, when you're leading, other junior researchers or senior, whatever their titles are. How do you go about, really assessing sort of their value and their contribution? Because oftentimes we hear, and I even heard it in the, I don't know if you were online for the last session of the Global Business Anthropology Summit, the one that was on branding of business anthropology. Bob Moraes was speaking.
Not this year's. No, I did 2 years ago. I did a workshop with Adam Gamwell on rebranding anthropology. So yeah.
Yeah. And so we'll come to that. But, there was a presentation sort of leading up to Bob speaking. And, there was a question at the very end of it, like, I don't remember the exact question, but it was something like, how do you demonstrate ROI? And this kind of thing keeps coming up and up. And so I'm curious to dig into that because of the role you're in. And the classic way of asking that is, again, like sort of how do we sort of gauge that from a client perspective? But you also kind of, in your role, you need to understand that from an employee perspective. Are they sort of contributing? And so, I'd be curious to have any of your thoughts, obviously, if there's anything sort of, intellectual property wise about how you're gauging people that you can't talk about, obviously just skip over it. But, I'd like to get any input you have on how do you go about first sort of gauging the work of your team.
Yeah. And I think this is a great thing for people to know who want to go into this type of work, specifically in my case, market research, because it's not just about, yes, it's definitely helpful to have the social science training, to have an understanding for how to look at human behavior. I personally am biased towards anthropology, of course, and maybe sociology, because I feel like we are usually better trained to look at the diversity of human experience as compared to some of the other social sciences that might not, approach things from quite as cross-cultural a perspective. But when it comes to assessing like your researcher's performance, it's more than just knowing your methods and knowing how to execute a particular method, whether it's an interview, conducting an interview, or moderating a focus group. It's also being able to make those connections between what is your client's business problem and how are you going to get the information that could help them with that problem from the data you collected, right? And can you then go one step further and give them actionable steps to take to try and address that business problem? And that's something that just takes time and experience. And, frankly, you can always get better at that. Including me, of course, because the more experience you have in a particular industry, the more you might have better ideas for how this business problem could be addressed. But even mundane things are important. Like you can be, really insightful and come up with great recommendations. But if you can't finish your project by the deadline I gave you, we got a problem, right? Like you've got to have time management skills. You've got to have project management skills. You got to use all that critical thinking you hopefully learned in school, because I have actually 12 people on my team right now. So I cannot possibly know all the minutia that they're dealing with for each project at one time, because they're doing multiple projects at a time, by the way. So I rely on them to use those critical thinking skills and notice when something's going to be a problem, right? So that could be something as simple as like, wow, we don't have a long enough contact list to get a decent number of interviews for this project. Or it could be something much deeper, like the research questions I was given to start from don't sound to me like what the client's talking about. Like maybe we're not in alignment here and we need to actually change the focus of this project before we get any deeper, because the client's talking about, for example, they want to hear from the community, right? They want to know what the community is looking for in their services. But this research question is talking about asking employers what they're looking for to hire people in the community. Those don't seem to be very well aligned. So let's dig into that. So, when you can rely on someone to not only know their methods, execute the project correctly and well on time, and be able to spot potential problem areas, then they are really they've really got it down. They know what they're doing. And that's incredibly, comforting that you don't have to be constantly looking over their shoulder and worried like, oh, something's going to fall through the cracks. We're going to have to clean up a mess, that's really important.
So, in the research space, there's obviously a lot of unknown unknowns that if you're removed from the actual research, you don't necessarily, you as the leader can't know if they are, whoever they is, in this case, like whoever the researcher is still missing those unknown unknowns. And so, it could be then that they're delivering potentially on time, and maybe it seems like it's aligned, with the business, but it still might not deliver the intended results. Now, I appreciate this is a little bit hard because you're essentially a consultative or kind of agency model, like we are most of the time. And so you sometimes are a little bit removed from like what happens after you kind of, do the readout or throw your kind of results over the wall. But do you try to then connect the researcher's performance to any kind of outcomes from like outcomes from a client perspective?
When they let us know, sure. Like we always ask for feedback, and we encourage them to let us know how they were able. Part of we have like an actual form that asks them, how are you going to apply the research that we did for you? And so just like any other time you're trying to get feedback from a client, unfortunately, we don't get as much of a response rate as we would like from those. And when you do get a response, it tends to be one of two extremes, right? They loved it. It was fabulous. We're going to use it this way. It's going to revolutionize our product line, whatever. Or this is not what we wanted at all. This is, you tend to get like people who are either really happy or really unhappy, as opposed to like, well, this is useful, but I don't know, maybe we could have done something else, So we can't really closely tie like the assessment of any one researcher's performance to how their research was applied to the business, but we certainly try to take the opportunity to, call out and recognize those folks when we do find out that, hey, they not only loved what you did for them, they were able to really use this in a positive way. So yes, and we would love it if more clients would share how they're using it. But since we're, an external agency and not in-house, we don't always have, unfortunately, that information.
Yeah, obviously, speaking again from like the tech perspective, it's much easier in, say, like a quote unquote product company. However, from the people I talk to, and it hasn't been anybody that I've asked so overtly on this podcast, but just from like, colleagues, networking, kind of doesn't seem like many people are tied back to really the performance of, say, the product they're working on, which is kind of surprising to me. Which, in a lot of products, I think can be done. A lot of tech products, especially that have dollars attached to them, can be done, I think, a little bit more clearly. If you're working on something foundational, like what is trust, I get that that's a little harder, but I'm still sort of surprised to see how few are doing that when it seems like there's an ability to do it. But anyway, thanks for sharing.
I also think that gets into what Bob, I think, has spoken to and even written about in terms of, trying to put anthropologists in places and companies where they can actually impact strategy and implementation. Mm-hmm. Because, so often we are in the situation that my team is, where we're external and we don't have, that position of power or authority to influence directly, like how our work is applied. And you definitely get the subgroup of clients who they just wanted their own bias confirmed. And you either did that and they're thrilled, or you didn't and they're unhappy, right? Like, so I think the problem is when you're not the decision maker that can then implement, the results of the research into the product, you have a whole nother level of convincing to do, because, a lot of times when they come to us, they already know what they want to do, right? So if it's not a truly exploratory project, you might have limited ability to influence how that product might be changed. So, yeah. Yeah,
and it's a fair point. And, since you mentioned, the need for more of us to be in strategy, which is something that I think a good sign is I keep hearing that coming up more frequently than I would have years ago. And as somebody who, works in a product role who's directly connected to strategy, I mean, I think we're really, well suited for those kind of roles. But there's other roles we're well suited for as well. So just out of curiosity, given your career and sort of, just your viewpoint of where you're at, besides like a classic sort of, kind of qual researcher or mixed methods researcher or UX researcher or whatever title somebody sort of takes today, you see other opportunities in the business space for anthropologists? Whether that's strategy roles
Yes.
or in my case, product management.
Yes, I really, really would love to see more anthropologists go into diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Yeah,
And
makes sense.
like, there should be more of us, frankly, in the HR space because, we are trained, and usually we got into this because we have an interest in working with people, right? And I hope that most of us have an interest in having a positive impact on people in our communities. And, especially anthropologists with our cross-cultural training, I think we are perfect for working in the diversity and inclusion space. And, I have done some of that, in the last 7-ish years, but I've always had an interest in it. I minored and had a graduate certificate in gender studies. And, I think it's really important because on the one hand, I mean, I'm a white woman, so I don't have, the position to contribute of a person of color. However, there are plenty of folks out there that might need to hear something from a white person that they wouldn't be as receptive to from a person of color, for better or for worse, right? So, I actually had our chief diversity officer at Clemson say that to me because I was all concerned. I was like, I don't know, should I be trying to do this stuff, as a white person? And he's like, Melissa, we need white folks to join us in this work because if it's just us, it's easier to dismiss us, and that really was a light bulb for me. So, I think anybody who has the interest, who feels passionately about it, I think that's a fabulous area for anthropologists to go into.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything in the HR space, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And HR is something that I haven't really touched on in this podcast yet, though I am trying. I thought I had one lined up, but it fell through. So, maybe later we can talk if you know anybody, but, or if anybody out there listening is in the field, feel free to reach out to me. But, so to pivot from, what you're currently doing a bit, you have an interest in raising the, visibility of business anthropology, broadly speaking. You've done a lot of things within that capacity, including the workshop that you and Adam did at the Global Business Anthropology Summit that was at Fordham, which now seems like forever ago. I guess that was 2019. So, I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask the question anyway for those who might not know your opinion. But do you think business anthropology has a branding problem?
Well, I would say anthropology has a branding problem because most people don't know business anthropology exists, right? Even within anthropology, people don't know business anthropology exists.
Yeah, fair
So,
point.
yeah, I mean, and I'm far from the first person to bring this up, but, ever since Margaret Mead passed away, we have not had a well-known figure out there that's speaking to the public on a regular basis and helping them understand what we do, what we contribute, what our expertise is, and I think there's a whole group of folks right now, fantastically, that are trying to do just that for business anthropology. It'd be great if we did that for all of anthropology, not just business anthropology. But I feel like, obviously, as business anthropologists, we have a big stake in, making sure people understand outside of the academic world what we do and how we can contribute. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you ask just somebody walking down the street, what does a psychologist do? They may not know all the details. They may not know all the subfields, all the different ways psychology is applied. but they probably can give you a decent idea of at least one type of psychology. I'm not sure the same could be said for anthropology, which is a shame. And, we see that reflected, unfortunately, especially during the pandemic, in the shrinking of anthropology programs, right? So, absolutely, I think we all need to be much more engaged with the public and, get out there and, just like what you're doing, Matt, with your podcast and, other folks getting involved in various public endeavors, whether it's locally in their community or, writing for national newspapers or any way they can to explain, Helen Fisher is the only person I can think of who's really gotten her name out there recently that people might recognize, as an anthropologist. So, we all need to work on that. And it's going to be up to anthropologists because nobody's going to do it for us.
Yeah. And, to be to drop another name, Jillian Tett and her new book, Anthrovision,
yes,
you're right, is also doing it.
I could grab it and hold it up for you.
Yeah. Mine's in the other room, but
here we go. There you go,
there
Jillian.
You go.
Shout out to your new book.
So
yes, there are more. Yes.
And, there are some initiatives going on, such as what, Bob was doing at the Global Business Anthropology Summit to sort of build on what you and Adam started. And so there's, this sort of initiative around, for anybody who doesn't know, about sort of branding business anthropology, kind of first here in the States, but then maybe that has some applicability globally. Maybe it doesn't, who knows? But, that process is being worked through. There's, of course, also businessanthro.com, right? So there's all these little things that are happening and,
yes.
And that's all great. But we still have the problem, and it's a related problem, but we still have the problem that most people don't know what anthropology is, like you said, but also that they should be hiring, anthropologists for these roles, or that we're even, we're even sort of in the same, that we're even in the running for them in many ways. And so while I think it's good that we all are sort of working on these initiatives, to be critical of, like, say, what I'm doing, most of the people who seem to interact with my content, at least on LinkedIn, because if you listen to a podcast, I don't know who you are that's listening. But if you interact on LinkedIn, I can obviously see, your background. Most people who interact, on LinkedIn are anthropologists. They are not people from the business space, broadly speaking, non-anthropologists. And so, in my case, they could be UX researchers, they could be other qualitative or social scientists, say, but it doesn't seem to get too much outside of that yet. So I guess the question is, seeing as you've thought about this a little, aside from all the efforts that we're engaged in, what can we do to move beyond just sort of like telling ourselves how good we are?
Yeah, you have to engage with folks that are already in the business world. And, I know, for example, Bob teaches in a business school, right? If you are teaching, reach out to your business school and see if you can teach the business students, because they may not be interested in majoring in anthropology, but I would bet you they would really benefit from 1 or 2 classes with an anthropologist, and it's going to make them better business people to have a more global mindset or to have a better understanding of human cultures and human behavior, whether it's doing it from an academic perspective where you're getting involved. When I was creating the business anthropology program at Clemson, I actually created an interdisciplinary curriculum committee. So we had, faculty from marketing, from industrial and organizational psychology, from the management program, from the MBA program. We were starting before I left to reach out to engineering even, because, engineers nowadays absolutely need to have an understanding of people and human behavior, or at least be willing to collaborate with folks who have an understanding of people and human behavior. And, funding organizations have already recognized this, right? So many big organizations like National Science Foundation require big engineering grants to have a social scientist on their team. Obviously, many of the big tech companies have already recognized that if they're going to, deal with human behavior, they need social scientists on their staff. So I think there's a multitude of ways that you can engage people outside of anthropology to understand the value of anthropology. Jillian's book and other people's book are trying to do the same thing. The fact that we're being active in spaces like LinkedIn or the Financial Times that aren't just, central to the anthropology profession, but to the larger business world is really important. So, and that's one thing that I wanted to do, that really doesn't fit super well, frankly, with an academic career, and was one of the littler pushes for me to leave academia. Is I wanted to be able to write and speak to the public. And in academia, that's like, oh, that's great. That's nice. Right? But you got to find time for that on top of what they really care about. Right? Which is the grants, which is the research publications, right? So, I think those of us that are already out there in the private sector, as if we don't already have enough to do, but like finding ways to, let's say you're in a different type of professional organization, like a marketing association, right? Like, see if you can give a little talk to them about the importance of anthropology or the social sciences to marketing, right? Like, branch out beyond us all speaking to each other. But that's the start.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's really, was the sort of basis of my TED Talk, which was intentionally to try and popularize it, to a much bigger audience. And I don't go deep, I don't hammer on anthropology in that. I just sort of drop it and out at the outro. But, that got more traction than anything else that I've worked on so far. And so, I think it's those kind of outlets that are really going to help bring it to, a broader audience. But it's also, other forms of media, I think, is a portion of it. And, certainly like, the certificate that you're involved in, we'll touch on that in just a second. I think that's great to sort of start influencing the next generation, because even the other day I had somebody who reached out who went through the program, seemed to really like the program, but they came from a different background. So that influences the next generation, but it doesn't necessarily reach maybe the current generation of power, if you will. Right. And so so that brings up I do think other forms of media are helpful, but I think it's also a question of what form of media, because, the podcast, I can't speak of podcasts broadly, but my podcast listening audience tends to be younger. Right. So if I'm not sure that this podcast is ever going to, I shouldn't say it that way, but if I'm thinking of targeting positions of power who are non-anthropologists, maybe this isn't the best avenue. Right. But maybe there are other mediums that would be better. I don't have the answer to that today, but I just think that we need to keep all of those things in mind, because, clearly we need to take this beyond ourselves, because we oftentimes get in a room and tell each other how great we are, but I don't see enough non-anthropologists in those rooms to hear it.
Yeah, but I think, kudos to you for making the cut on your TED Talk, because that takes a level of skill at public speaking and shaping your ideas. Because I actually tried to get a TED. I did our little local Greenville competition, and I made the first cut, and then I didn't make the next cut to make it, into the bigger TEDx Greenville presentation. So it's practice, and it's developing those skills. And, like you said, I'm going to throw out a generalization that may not be true, but maybe folks over 50 in positions of power aren't listening to a lot of podcasts. I don't know. And so we need to write op-eds for the, Washington Post and the New York Times, right? That's why Jillian's work with the Financial Times is so important, right? So yeah, absolutely. Using different forms of media and different venues to reach different folks.
And agreed. And so maybe to close, so, you've done your own, bit in helping that. Like I said, I had this person who went through the program, the Clemson University Business Anthropology Certificate Program, again, non-anthropologist who went through that. So obviously, what you did there to help start that is sort of helping to train another generation of people who maybe are coming from other disciplines. So I think that's great. So thanks for all you did there. And maybe we can just kind of talk about it a bit. So for anybody who's listening that hasn't come across any of it yet, you want to maybe just give us the elevator pitch?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to speak mostly to the online professional certificate, because that's basically open to anyone from any background. It's totally geared towards folks who already, have to balance their day job with, taking a class or two. So this is not the same intensity as, a full-time for credit program. If you want that, however, and you happen to be able to connect with Clemson, that is still available through Clemson. But, the one that I'm offering online, this is a great chance, either if you don't have a social science background, to learn a little about why having some social science knowledge could be advantageous to you in the business world. So it's a 3-course certificate. The first one is a business anthropology overview, where we basically touch on what anthropology can contribute to the business world in the sort of 3 major areas, which is market research, organizational culture, and design anthropology. And we weave into that a little bit of the international and intercultural components, because that's, I think, a super important way that anthropology can help business folks develop a global mindset and really reach new audiences they might not have even thought about before. The second course is your basic overview of qualitative methods, and very much for applied settings. So not for someone who's trying to have an academic career. This is all project-based learning, by the way. You have to do a project for both courses, and you have to do it in a very short amount of time, because that's what you're going to have to do in the business world. You're not going to have 6 months, a year, 2 years to do your project. You're going to have a few weeks, right? Maybe if you're lucky, 2 months at most, right? So you do project-based learning, you learn your business anthropology overview, you learn your qualitative methods, and then we wrap it up with a capstone seminar, which is shorter, but it's a nice chance for us to talk about, okay, how do I take this learning from these 2 courses and now directly apply it to my career? So we talk about teamwork, leadership, and strategy. So, how can I be a good team member? How can I be a leader? And then how am I going to be strategic about using this in my career? So, we took one cohort through it in winter/spring of 2020, and it was fantastic. We had participation even from a couple folks in Europe. So you don't have to be in the US to participate. We try to have the discussions at times where people in different time zones can contribute, and we record them. So if you miss it, you can listen to it. So yeah, that was probably a little longer than your typical elevator speech, but I can go on and on. So yes, please
shows your
reach out
lineage
if you're interested. Yeah. Oh, and deadline-wise, classes start September 1. And so we'd really love if folks can register, if possible, by August 1.
Great. And I think, for anybody listening, that's great for any of the non-anthropologists who are listening, other social scientists and UX researchers coming from different disciplines. But I think it's also good for any of us anthropologists to know that we might want to recommend to colleagues who are kind of adjacent to us, who are interested in this, maybe not to maybe step into our roles, but to maybe be a better team player, right? Just to know enough, to sort of make for a really strong team. So I think, it's good for any of us to recommend that. And I'll link to it, of course, in the show notes, and have written about it actually before on both Business Anthro, my website. I've posted about it a few times, but I'll link to it again. And so I think you're also hiring, I saw on LinkedIn, right?
Oh,
so
yes. I should mention that, yes, I am hiring for my team right now. I actually have a couple full-time roles for research analysts. So yes, look for me on LinkedIn. I've got the posting there, or go to Hanover's site, hanoverresearch.com. And under the careers listing, you'll see that job and a number of other jobs posted for folks who might want to do survey, for example. So,
and I know you just said LinkedIn, but is that the best place to find you?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Melissa, thanks very much. Appreciate your time. I'll link to everything, and talk soon.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Matt. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Anthropology in Business podcast. To learn everything you need to break into business anthropology and why business anthropology is one of the best lenses for contributing to business success, visit my website at mattartz.me, where I cover many topics related to business anthropology and beyond. There you will find all the podcast episodes, blogs, and news. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.